so you can see that there's a small GIF that I had included just to show how you are rotating a polygon about a point. Okay, just an example was being shown how a polygon is being rotated about a point. Now, before coming to all that, let us understand what exactly rotation is. You're trying to, it is, we are basically studying two-dimensional rotation. Okay, it is applied to an object, okay, by repositioning it along a circular path in the xy plane. You can see that the object is moving in a circular path. It is being rotated by a particular angle, okay, and it is being, when you rotate it, you are actually rotating it in a circular path, along a circular path, and in which plane it is being done? It is done in an xy plane. Now we say that to generate a rotation, now if you have to do this rotation, we have to specify by what angle we are rotating at a particular instant. Okay, ഒരു particular instantൽ നമ്മൾ എത്ര ആംഗിൾ വെച്ചാണ് റൊട്ടേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് പോണെന്നാണ് നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നത്. And that angle is denoted by the symbol theta. This will be denoted by the symbol theta. And then you also have to say the pivot point about which you are going to do the rotation. The pivot point is given by xr, yr. Here r and y have to be subscript. Okay. So the position, the pivot point is said to be xr, yr, about which the object is to be rotated. Now looking at the example on the right hand side, you can see that my angle, say here the angle is said to be, the angle by which it is said to be rotating is said to be theta. And the pivot point about which it is rotating, here it is said to be what? It is said to be, if you can see here, what's your x value and what is your y value? X value is 0 and your y value is said to be -1. So the pivot point for this particular diagram is given like that. Now in this case, the second diagram that I have drawn, which has been there at the bottom, second picture that you can see, in that you can see that the angle of rotation for this particular point xy, okay, it is said to be, the new point is said to be after rotating it by an angle of theta. And in which direction is my object moving, children? In the left hand side diagram also you can see that it is not moving in clockwise direction, it is moving in an anti-clockwise direction. You can also make it move in the clockwise. The only thing is the value has to be changed. I'll tell you about that. So I am moving this particular point x comma y, okay, to a point x dash y dash when I rotate it by an angle of theta. Okay, at what point? That there has to be a pivot point about which this particular point has to be rotated. And that pivot point here is given as xr, yr is said to be what? The pivot point is my origin, which is said to be 0, 0. So when I rotate my point x, y about my origin by an angle theta, I get my new point that is said to be x dash y dash. That is what the definition means. Now the theta value that we were talking about, it can take two types of values. It can take positive values as well as it can take negative values. When my theta takes positive value, you should remember that means I'm trying to move my point in an anti-clockwise direction. I'm trying to move my point in an anti-clockwise direction. And when I want to have my rotation in a clockwise direction, okay, so number theta value in there, it has to be negative value. Has to be negative value. Now this transformation, it is actually described as a rotation about a rotation axis, isn't it? It is about a axis generate cheyyam. And that axis is actually what? It is perpendicular to the xy plane. So axis, imagine you can see that this is your xy plane, okay, and then you have axis about which a point rotate. So it is considered as perpendicular to the xy plane and passes through the pivot point. So my pivot point here is said to be 0, 0. Okay, so the transformation is described as a rotation about a rotation axis that is said to be perpendicular to this xy plane, and it is going to pass through the pivot point. Even the pivot point here is said to be 0, 0. Now we are saying that let us first determine the transformation equations for rotation of a point P when the pivot point is at coordinate origin. When we example consider, okay, in that example what we had a point So what we are saying is we have a point P which is said to be x comma y, which has got the coordinate values x comma y, and I need to rotate it by an angle theta and place it in a new position that is said to be called as x dash y dash. Okay, so how do I go about it? How do I find the equation for my transformation for rotation? Rotation വേണ്ടിയുള്ള transformation equation ആണ് ഞാൻ കണ്ടുപിടിക്കുന്നത്. Now if you take the point P which is x comma y, അപ്പോൾ ആ പോയിന്റ് നമ്മൾ കൺസിഡർ ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ എന്താ കാണുന്നത്? It is at a distance of, it is at a horizontal distance of x from the origin, and it is at a vertical distance of y from the y-axis, isn't it, this particular point? അപ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് ആക്ച്വലി ഈ പോയിന്റ്സിനെ ഞാൻ കൺസിഡർ ചെയ്യണമെങ്കിൽ this particular point, if I draw an imaginary line which joins my origin and this point, I can say that this distance is said to be r. I can say this distance is said to be r. Now how can I define this distance r? To define this distance r, I say that ഈ ഒരു particular point ne connect ചെയ്യുന്ന line to my origin is subtending an angle of phi. It is said to be subtending an angle of phi with my x-axis. It is said to be subtending an angle of phi with my x-axis. Now you all maybe remember, if you have cos 5 or cos any symbol that you use, cos in the value endana, it is always equal to x divided by r, isn't it? This particular value divided by this particular value. So in short, I can always say my x is said to be what? You can always say x is equal to cos 5. You can always say x is equal to cos 5. So can I write here my x? Okay, x is said to be what? It is said to be r cos 5. And what would be my y, children? What would be my y? Can you define my y? Y can be written as, y is this particular value, isn't it? This is said to be my y. And if I have to write it in terms of r and y, so I have to, instead of using cos, I'll have to use sine. I'll have to use sine. So sine phi is said to be what? It is equal to the opposite, that is y by r. Or you can say that y is equal to r sine phi. Or you can say y is equal to r sine phi. Now how do I find x dash y dash? How do I find x dash y dash? See, the x dash y dash is at this particular point. Again, I imagine that there is a line which is said to be joining my x dash y dash to my origin 0, and it is going to be of the same length as that, same distance as that my x and y was from my 0. So even then in the value could come, I can call it as r. This value can be called as r. So what is the angle which is subtended by this particular line on my x-axis? It is actually, I know from this point, from point x, from point P to P dash, rotation angle is what? It is given as theta. Rotation angle is said to be theta. And what is the angle between the point, the line for which has an endpoint P of x comma y subtending on x-axis? It is said to be phi. So the total angle, I can take it as phi plus theta. So I can take it as phi plus theta. So I can say that cos of phi, theta plus phi, or phi plus theta, is said to be equal to what? What can I say? What can I say? What can I say? What would it be? It is going to be my new value, that is x dash by r. It is going to be my x dash by r. Same way, what is my sine of theta plus phi? It will be equal to y dash by r. So I can write that my x dash is actually equal to r cos theta plus 5. Okay, and what is my y dash? Y dash is equal to r sine theta plus 5. I can write it like this. Now you must have studied what is cos of a plus b. You must have studied what is cos of a plus b. What is cos of a plus b? It is cos a cos b minus of sin a sin b. Okay. And what about your sin a plus b? Sin a plus b can be defined as sin a cos b minus of cos a sin b, minus of cos a into sin b. So if I try to write this equation x dash and y dash in terms of the given formula for cos a plus b and sin a plus b, my x dash will get a value r cos, please remember r cos theta plus phi. It can be written as r into cos theta plus phi is just like a plus b. So what is this? Cos a പകരം നമ്മൾ എന്ത് എഴുതും? Cos theta dot cos phi minus of sin theta dot sin phi. Okay, which can be written, normally we can write it as r cos theta dot cos phi minus of r sin theta dot sin phi. We can write it like this, isn't it? And we also found what is my x. What is my x? X is equal to r cos phi. R cos phi it is going to be my x followed by cos theta minus of r and sin phi so y sin theta. So I can say my x dash is equal to x cos theta minus of y sin theta. So this is how I find the value of my x dash. The same way I can find the value of my y dash also in terms of my x and y. So y dash is said to be equal to what? It is actually r sine of theta plus phi, which can be written as r sine a plus b. I'll directly write the value. Okay, sine of a, that is theta, dot, okay, cos of 5 minus of r. Bracket in direct I am writing all the terms. So cos of a, cos of theta, dot sine of b b phi r. Now I know that my r cos 5, okay, if I have r cos 5, I have r cos phi, which is equal to what? It is going to be my x sine theta minus of r sine phi. So r sine phi and then y of cos theta. I got it from here. Okay, so I can write my y dash is equal to what? X sine theta minus of y cos theta. I hope this much is clear with everyone. Now, either മനസ്സിലായിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ what about the remaining? You can, I'll just write once again. What was my x, children? My x was actually equal to r of cos phi and my y was equal to r of sin phi, isn't it? And what about my x dash? X dash was something as x, which is given as x cos theta, isn't it? It was given as x cos theta minus of y sin theta. And what was my y dash equal to? Y dash was equal to x sin theta plus y cos theta. This is what I had got from x dash and y dash. Now, how do I represent it? This is represent in my matrix form. Matrix form x dash y dash represent I know this is going to be my new point. That is the column matrix. Same way with my x and y also, I can show it as x, y. Okay, so I need to multiply it with something, isn't it? I need to multiply it with something so that I get this value. Now look here, you have cos theta, sin theta. So I can simply write it as cos theta. Here it is minus symbol, so I write it as minus of sin theta. Here it is sin theta, so I'll write here as sin theta. Here is said to be cos theta plus plus cos theta. So when you use your multiplication rule, that is cos theta into x. This can be written as x cos theta, okay, minus of y sin theta. Then you will get it as x sin theta plus y cos theta. So that is going to give my, this will give my x dash value and this will give my y dash value. This is how you get. So this is your matrix representation for your rotation. Okay, rotation transformation which is caused by rotation. So I hope you have understood this. Now once you have understood this was all the end in the basis la cheyda. Nammal pivot point evideyana? Pivot point is at the origin. The pivot point is said to be at origin. Now imagine the pivot point is not at the origin. Nammal pivot point origin la allatha case aanengil, how do we go about it? Now how are we going to look about it? That is, it is at some arbitrary point. It is at some arbitrary point. So let me take my x and the y axis. Okay, so I have my x axis and I have my y axis. Now I'm saying that instead of my origin being my pivot point, I'll consider some point that is at a distance of x r. okay, and which is at a distance of yr, okay, it is going to be at a distance of xr, and this is going to be at a distance of yr from my origin. അതാണ് എൻ്റെ pivot point. ആ pivot point നെ വെച്ച് respect ചെയ്തിട്ട് the point that I want to rotate, that is p is xy, and I want to rotate it by some particular angle theta to a new point that's called as p dash, that is going to have a value x dash y dash. So the distance between these two, let it be given as r. Then rotate cheyumbom, this is also going to be the same line, isn't it? That is also going to be r. And the angle by which I am going to rotate is said to be theta. നമ്മൾ നേരത്തെ ചെയ്ത പോലെ തന്നെ നമ്മൾ എന്ത് ചെയ്യണം? We will be just, extending this line, okay? And we imagine that it is same as this particular horizontal x-axis. So we imagine that it is extending an angle of phi. It is said to be extending an angle of phi with this horizontal x-axis. That is what we imagine. നമ്മൾ നേരത്തെ ഉള്ള ഒരു equation, what was the equation for x dash and what was the equation for y dash? X dash in the equation was, depending on x, it was cos theta minus of sin theta. Okay, you can just remember cos theta minus sin theta. E value തന്നെ ഇവിടെ വരും, that is sin theta. Okay, diagonal values are all same, that is said to be cos theta. ഇവിടെ ഒരു plus വരും. This is going to be xy and this is going to be my xy. So this is how the value was. Now, when it has been shifted by a position of x dash y dash, അപ്പോൾ ഈ നമ്മൾ x എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ വാല്യൂ എന്തായിരുന്നു? What was this x? Now let us write it in detail. What was my x? X, if you remember, it was r cos phi. Okay, it was r cos phi. So I can write it as x dash was actually r cos phi, isn't it? It was r cos phi cos theta minus of what was y? Y was r sin 5 into sin theta. So again, I can write my y dash also. Y dash is equal to r cos 5 into sin theta plus y and then r sin 5 dot cos theta. So this we had. ഇനി നമ്മൾ എന്താ പറഞ്ഞ, what was this actually? r എന്തായിരുന്നു? നമ്മൾ ഒറിജിനിൽ നിന്ന് നമ്മൾ എക്സിന്റെ വരെ ഉള്ള വാല്യൂ ആയിരുന്നു ആറിന്റെ വാല്യൂ നമുക്ക് വന്നുകൊണ്ടിരുന്നത് അല്ലേ? That was my r value. Now what has happened? What has happened here? You can remember that നമ്മൾ എക്സിന്റെ വാല്യൂ, this x value, this total x value, ഇപ്പോൾ എക്സിന്റെ വാല്യൂ ഇത്രയാണ് അല്ലെ? നമ്മൾ ഇത് വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ പറഞ്ഞത്, നമ്മൾ ഈ ഇക്വേഷനിൽ നിന്ന് we had derived my x dash, ഈ ഒരു ഇക്വേഷനിൽ നിന്ന് I derived my y dash. So now is x എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ 0 എന്ന് x ഉള്ള വാല്യൂ ആണോ? അല്ല, ഇവിടെ വച്ച് it is only considering this much part of my x. What is this much part of my x? The total x നിന്ന് ഞാൻ എത്ര പോർഷൻ റിമൂവ് ചെയ്യണം? xr പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു പോർഷൻ ഞാൻ റിമൂവ് ചെയ്യണം. Okay, the point x, I hope you are getting my this thing, and the point x comma y. Okay, it was actually if you see here, this is the total x അല്ലേ? ഇത്രയും x ആണ്. ബട്ട് ഞാൻ ഇപ്പം പിവറ്റ് പോയിന്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഈ ഒരു പോയിന്റ് അല്ല, എൻ്റെ പോയിന്റ് ഇവിടെ നിന്നാണ് സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് എക്സ് ആർ കോമ വൈ ആർ, ഈ പോയിന്റിൽ നിന്നാണ് തുടങ്ങാൻ. സോ ഇത്രയും പോർഷൻ, ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് ദിസ് മച്ച് പോർഷൻ ഹാസ് ടു ബി കട്ട് ഫ്രം മൈ എക്സ്. ഓൺലി ദിസ് മച്ച്, ഈ ഒരു ലൈനിനെ മാത്രമേ ഞാൻ കൺസിഡർ ചെയ്യുന്നുള്ളൂ. So what do I have to do? I have to make modification to my x. So what is my new value of my x? Okay, the new value of my x is going to be x minus of xr. So അതേപോലെ എൻ്റെ y ആണെങ്കിലും ഞാൻ എടുക്കുന്നത് ഈ ടോട്ടൽ y അല്ലേ എടുക്കുന്നത്, അങ്ങനെ അല്ലല്ലോ വരേണ്ടത്. I am starting at this location, that is said to be yr. So അങ്ങനെ വരുമ്പം this much portion of yr has to be deducted from my y value also. So y, how will I write? I'll write as y minus of yr. The same change I'm going to make it here also. When the object has been moved, my object has been moved from the origin by this much distance. E xr yr distance vechittu njan ende pivot point ne njan move cheyidittundu. That I have to show in my x. That is, I'll have to add xr to this. I'll have to add xr to this particular changed value. Same way, y indeyum ade corresponding aayittu shift aayitundallo. So I'll have to write yr plus. Okay, so I'll just show you once again. I hope you've understood what I'm trying to say. Okay, so this actually was with respect to 0. But then we move we brought it to a point which is said to be called as xr yr. we have shifted by a position of xr yr, and പിന്നെ അതിന്റെ ബേസിസിലാണ് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞ I've got a point that is p, okay, which has been rotated by an angle theta, and it has been brought to p dash, and this is said to be r എന്ന് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞു, and this I am saying this is said to be parallel to my x-axis, and I'm assuming that it is subtending an angle of phi. അതിന്റെ ബേസിസിൽ I wrote my x dash and y dash. So what modifications I have to bring? So original value of my x dash, I remember it was given as x of cos theta. Okay, it was x of cos theta minus of y of sin theta. ഇവിടെ എന്തായിരുന്നു? It was x of sin theta plus y of cos theta. So I said that നമ്മൾ shift ചെയ്തു. We have shifted from the origin to the new position that is said to be xr yr. So എത്ര പോർഷൻ ആണ് എക്സിൽ നമ്മൾ മേലോട്ട് മൂവ് ചെയ്തു, എത്ര പോർഷൻ ആണ് വൈയിൽ നമ്മൾ ചേഞ്ച് വന്നത്. So x has been moved by xr position. So plus that you have to write this xr component there. വൈയിൽ എത്ര പോർഷൻ വെച്ച് മേളിലോട്ട്, ദിസ് ഇസ് ലെഫ്റ്റിലോട്ട് നമ്മൾ മൂവ് ചെയ്തത്, റൈറ്റിലോട്ട് മൂവ് ചെയ്തത് ബൈ xr പൊസിഷൻ, ആൻഡ് മേളിലോട്ട് നമ്മൾ വൈനെ എത്ര മൂവ് ചെയ്ത് ബൈ r പൊസിഷൻ വെച്ച്. ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് വൈ വി ഹാവ് ടു ആഡ് ദാറ്റ് ടേം വിത്ത് ദ ആക്ച്വൽ റൊട്ടേഷന്റെ ഇക്വേഷന്റെ കൂടെ. അപ്പൊ അങ്ങനെ വരുമ്പം when you have pushed it by a position on top right, what are I supposed to be doing? നമ്മൾ ഈ ആക്ച്വൽ x y യുടെ വാല്യൂ will change. What is the new value of x? X is said to be x minus of xr. What is the value of y? Y is equal to y minus of yr. What is the value of x? Here you will change x minus xr. Y യുടെ value എന്താണ്? Y minus of yr. So when the pivot point is not at the origin, it is at some arbitrary point which is given as xr yr, how do you change the equation of your transformation? How do you change your equation for your rotation? That is what I have shown you here. Okay, it's very simple. ഒരു പ്രാവശ്യം കൂടെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവും. So that was for your rotation. Now next, even if നമുക്കിപ്പം ഇതിപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ ഒരു എക്സാമ്പിൾ ഒരു പോയിന്റ് വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ളത്. Now if you consider a polygon also, if you consider a polygon, okay, which is having a point p1, p2, p3. So what will you do? You will apply rotation on point p1 with respect to some arbitrary point, and you will move that point p1 to p1 dash. Then you will move this point p3 with respect to the pivot point, and you will come to some other location that is said to be p3 dash. ഇനി ഇതിനെ നമ്മൾ റൊട്ടേറ്റ് ചെയ്യും. Okay, this is also being rotated by some angle, and you can say this is p2 dash, and then കിട്ടിയ resultant ആയിട്ടുള്ള ആ വാല്യൂ വെച്ചിട്ട് നമ്മൾ എന്താ ചെയ്യുന്നത്? We'll be plotting our new polygon. Okay, so that is how we do it. You don't have to learn an equation about it. You just have to remember ഒരു പോയിന്റിൽ നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മൾ റൊട്ടേഷൻ അപ്ലൈ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഒരു പോളിഗണിലാണ് all the equations have to be written in terms of your point. Okay, ഒരു പോയിന്റ് നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് റൊട്ടേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് about a fixed point that is said we call as a pivot point. അതിന് ഇക്വേഷൻ എഴുതി കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഒരു പോളിഗണിനെ കുറിച്ച് നമ്മളടുത്ത് ചോദിക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ consider that p1 is one of the points, p2 as another point, p3 as another point, and then you apply your deflection or your rotation by an angle of theta, and then ആ കിട്ടിയ ന്യൂ പോയിന്റ്സ് വെച്ചിട്ട് നമ്മൾ എന്താ ചെയ്താൽ മതി? ലൈൻസ് ഡ്രോ ചെയ്താൽ മതി, so that you will get your new polygon. Okay, next is said to be scaling. Scaling പറഞ്ഞാൽ സൈസ്, നമുക്ക് ഒരു ഓബ്ജക്റ്റിന്റെ സൈസ് നമുക്ക് അതിനെ കൂട്ടാൻ പറ്റും, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമുക്ക് അതിനെ കുറയ്ക്കാൻ പറ്റും. You can increase or decrease the size. It is altering the size of your object. Now what we do is, ഒരു polygon നമുക്ക് തന്നിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അതിന്റെ if we are given a polygon of this particular form, or you can say a rectangle or a square, so അതിന്റെ ഓരോ പോയിന്റിന് നമ്മൾ എന്ത് ചെയ്യണം? We have to multiply the coordinate values of each vertex. Okay, ആ പോളിഗണിന്റെ ഓരോ വേർട്ടെക്സിന്റെ coordinate value ne you have to multiply it with a scaling factor which is given as s of x and s of y. Okay, that is, this is the scaling transformation in the x axis, and this is the scaling transformation in your y axis. appo x axis il etra matram korakkano kootano ennu parnittaan sx inde value varunathu, sy ide value parunathu y axis il nammal etra korakkanam kootunanu parayunnathu. Okay, so that you get a new transformed coordinate for that particular point as x dash y dash. So in short, we can write it as that x dash, what is the relationship between your x dash and x when you are performing a scaling? x നെ നമ്മൾ multiply ആണ് ചെയ്യണത് with the scaling factor. Okay, so x will be multiplied by the scaling factor in your x direction and y will be multiplied with the scaling factor in the y direction. Because it is not required that the same scaling value has to be applied in both x and y. It will differ. It may be same, it may be different. Okay, we'll see those cases also. So, അങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മൾ കാണിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള relationship between x and x dash when a scaling factor is said to be applied or a scaling transformation is said to be applied. Now, how do you show this in a show the equation? ഈ ഒരു equation നമുക്ക് എങ്ങനെയാണ് matrix ഫോമിൽ കാണിക്കുന്നത്? Obviously, you have x dash and y dash which is equal to, remember that you are giving your input as x and y. Okay, x ന്റെ കൂടെ നമ്മൾ എന്ത് മാത്രമേ മൾട്ടിപ്ലൈ ആവാൻ പാടുള്ളൂ? x മാത്രമേ മൾട്ടിപ്ലൈ ആവാൻ പാടുള്ളൂ. y യുടെ കൂടെ ഏത് വാല്യൂ മൾട്ടിപ്ലൈ ആവാൻ പാടുള്ളൂ? The only value is sy. So remaining I'll put it as 0. So if you see this, it is going to come as sx into x, okay, plus 0 into y. The other next rule endana 0 into x plus sy into y. So ultimately you will get it as what? X into sx and y into sy. And what is this actually? That is x into sx will give you your x dash value, y into sy will give you your y dash value. So that is how you represent it in your matrix form. Next we are going to see that നമുക്ക് values എന്താണ് നമുക്ക് sx നും sy നും assign ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്നത്. What are the values which are being assigned to the scaling parameters? So it says that if you have the value of sx and sy which is said to be less than 1, okay, if it is less than 1, it will obviously reduce the size of the object. ഇപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ ഒരു 0.5 ആണ് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ളത്. x ന്റെ value 10 ആണ്. So what is x dash? It is equal to x into sx, right? X is 10, 10 into 0.5 ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ എന്താണ് അതിന്റെ 50%, that is 5 ആണ് വാല്യൂ വരാൻ. So what is it doing? It is actually reducing the size of my object, okay? And if the value is greater than 1, it is obviously it is going to enlarge. If 0.5 program 1.5 it would have been more, isn't it? I would have got, instead of 10, I would have got 15. Now, what if your values, that is sx and sy, the scaling parameters, they have the value as 1. Random 1 anengi, that means if I multiply 10 into 1, okay, so what will I get? I will get 10. That is, there is no change in the size shape. It doesn't change the size of my object. What if രണ്ടിനും sx നും sy നും same value ആണ് ഞാൻ കൊടുത്തിട്ടുള്ളത്? That is, you are trying to expand the object by the same value on both the axes. X axis ലും same value, y axis ലും same value. അങ്ങനെ വരുമ്പോൾ രണ്ട് സൈഡിലും ഒരു യൂണിഫോം സ്കെയിലിംഗ് ആണ് നടക്കുന്നത്. But if you provide a different value, that is, if you try to provide a different value, that is, your sx and sy are set to be different. And നമ്മൾ പറയുന്ന x axis ഒരു 10 വെച്ച് ഇൻക്രിമെന്റ് ചെയ്ത് കൊടുക്കുക, y axis ഒരു 5 വെച്ച് ഇൻക്രിമെന്റ് ചെയ്ത് കൊടുക്കുക. Is it going to be a uniform scaling? No, it is going to be a differential scaling. It is going to be a differential scaling. നമ്മൾ ഈ സ്കെയിലിംഗ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ ഒരു വലിയൊരു ഫാക്ടർ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്ന എന്താണ്, അത് സ്കെയിൽ മാത്രമല്ല ചെയ്യുന്നത്, ഇറ്റ് ഓൾസോ റീപൊസിഷൻസ് ദി ഓബ്ജെക്ട്. ഓക്കെ, അതിനെ റീപൊസിഷനും കൂടെ ചെയ്യും, അതിന് വേറെ ലൊക്കേഷനിലോട്ട് തന്നെ വലിച്ചെടുക്കുക. Okay, it is moving it to some other location also. So we say that when you have the scaling factors which are having value less than 1, okay, so in the case like 0.5, if the x-axis, let us take x is equal to 10 and y is also equal to 10, and you can say my scaling factor sx is equal to 0.5 and s5 is also equal to 0.5, and the same. So angane aanengil what is happening? What is my y dash? Y dash is also equal to 5. So earlier in my x-axis I had a point, okay, I had a point which was at 10, 10. I had a point at 10, 10. So scaling factor 0.5, that is, it is less than 1 per direction. I get the value as 5, 5. I get the value as 5, 5. So what has happened? When your scaling factor is less than 1, it moves the object closer to the coordinate origin. And the object pand evideyaanu, adu evideyayi ivide vannu. That means it is closer to this coordinate origin. Origin ennum close ayi when my scaling factor is said to be less than 1. So you can imagine if it is more than 1 almost validam. If I give 1.5, It will go somewhere here. I'll get 15 comma 15. So that means it is moving away from my coordinate origin. That is other interpretation of your scaling. So normally ഒരു animations ഓരോ കാര്യങ്ങൾ അങ്ങനത്തെ ഡിസൈൻ ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ where these rotations, translations and all are said to be required, these small things have to be kept in mind. Only then you can show. Okay. അടുത്ത പറയുന്നത് നമുക്കിപ്പം they're saying that when you're doing scaling ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ പറഞ്ഞു നമ്മുടെ ഓബ്ജക്റ്റ് മൂവ് ചെയ്യാണ്. It is moving. When the scaling factor is less, it is moving towards the coordinate axis. When the scaling factor is more, it is moving away from the scaling axis. അങ്ങനെയാണെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നത് സ്കെയിൽ ചെയ്യാം. Okay, we can reduce or increase the size of my parameters by fixing it at a particular point. ഒരു particular point വെച്ച് റെസ്പെക്ട് ചെയ്തിട്ട് with respect to a particular point, I will determine ഈ ഒരു എൻ്റെ ഒരു ഇങ്ങനത്തെ ഒരു polygon ഉണ്ടെന്ന് വിചാരിച്ചു. So I'll be, what I'm going to do is with respect to this point, I'm going to scale my object. അപ്പോൾ അത് അവിടെ തന്നെ ഇരുന്നിട്ട് അത് അതിൻ്റെ സൈസ് കൂട്ടുകയും കുറയ്ക്കുകയും ചെയ്യും. Because now it is not the origin, it is with respect to this point. Now what is this point, this fixed point? We can call it as xf comma yf. I can call it as xf comma yf, or my pivot point I can say. I've got a fixed point here. So with respect to this fixed point, I can do some changes. I already know what my x dash and what my y dash is, isn't it? X dash and it is x into my sx and y into my sy. Now this was with respect to what? This was with respect to my origin. Okay, it was with respect to my origin. നേരത്തെ നമ്മൾ റൊട്ടേഷനിൽ പഠിച്ച പോലെ തന്നെ when you move your fixed point from origin to some other point, നമ്മൾ എന്താ ചെയ്യുന്നത്? ആ അത്രയും വാല്യൂവിനെ നമ്മൾ കൂട്ടി കൊടുക്കുകയാണ്. This particular value, that is xf, will be added here. It will be added here. അല്ലേ? ഈ ഒരു വാല്യൂ, that is yf. Okay. Now that will also be added here. Now what is the change in your x value and y value? Obviously അത് മൂവ് ചെയ്തില്ലേ? അപ്പോൾ ഇത്രയും നമ്മൾ കൺസിഡർ ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ടോ as a part of its x value? No. So you have to write it as x minus of xf. And what about y? You will have to write it as y minus of yf, isn't it? So the new equation, you can write it as your x dash is equal to xf plus x minus of xf into your sx, isn't it? It is equal into s into x. What about your y dash? Y dash is equal to yf plus y minus of yf into your sy. This is what we have got. Okay, so ഇതിന് വേണമെങ്കിൽ ഈ equations, now let me number it as 1. Okay, I can call it as equation 1 and equation 2. Simplify ചെയ്യാം. I can write x dash is equal to xf plus x into xx minus xf into xx. I can rearrange and write it as x into xx plus, I'm going to take xf common, 1 minus of sx. ഇങ്ങനെ എനിക്ക് എഴുതാം the first equation. Second equation, I can write it as yf plus y into sy minus of yf into sy, which can be again grouped. Okay, so y into sy, okay, plus yf പുറത്തെടുത്തിട്ട് 1 minus of fy. I can call this as either point. This particular part of my equation is something called as a constant value, because it is only dependent on xf and yf. അതെപ്പോഴും അതിലല്ലേ മാറുന്ന change ഇവിടെ basically if you change now, instead of taking p1 is x comma y, okay, p2 is going to be x2 comma y2. So ഇവിടെ എല്ലാം എന്താ ഞാൻ മാറ്റുന്നത്? x ന്റെ വാല്യൂ മാത്രം മാറ്റി കൊടുത്താൽ മതി. ബാക്കി it is going to be constant. Okay, that is അങ്ങനെ നമുക്ക് computation reduce ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. p3 എടുത്താലും it is going to be x3 comma y3. So what is changing? This x and y value is changing. വേറെ ഒന്നും മാറുന്നില്ല. Okay, that is why we call this part of my equation in equation 1 and 2 as constant values. So now that you have understood how you can do the scaling,